I've never told this story in full, not to my therapist, not to my best friend, not to the grief counselor the hospital assigned me when I was 20 years old and suddenly a widow. But it's 2:47 a.m. and I've been staring at the ceiling for 3 hours, and I think if I don't write this down, it's going to live inside my chest forever and quietly kill me. So here it is, all of it. My name is Elena. I'm 24 now, and I need you to understand something before I start. I know how this sounds. I know exactly what assumptions you're already making. I made them too. I was 18 years old the first time I understood that love could feel like a trap. My father had been the kind of man who fixed things: broken pipes, broken toys, broken neighbors. He owned a small construction company in Texas. Nothing flashy, just honest work that fed us and put me through school and made our house smell like sawdust on weekends. Growing up, I thought he was invincible. He had these enormous hands, calloused and warm. I used to think nothing bad could touch us as long as those hands were around. Then everything collapsed in about 8 months. It started with a bad investment his business partner convinced him to make, then a lawsuit from that same partner, who had apparently been siphoning money for years and decided to blame my father when the books stopped balancing. Lawyers. Court dates, frozen accounts. The company my father built over 20 years dissolved like sugar in rain. And then, just to make sure the universe had finished laughing, my father had a heart attack. Stage 3 heart failure. I remember the hospital so clearly it hurts. The green walls, the particular pitch of the monitors, the way time moves differently in ICUs, slow and syrupy and somehow also too fast. I sat next to his bed for 4 days straight, leaving only to shower in the family bathroom down the hall. On the third night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a sound I had never heard in my entire life. My father was crying. Not the quiet, dignified kind, the ugly kind, the kind that comes from somewhere below the stomach. He had one hand pressed over his mouth like he was trying to hold it in, and the machines were beeping steadily, indifferently, and he had no idea I was watching. My father had not cried at my mother's funeral. He had not cried when the lawyers came. He was crying now. I pretended to be asleep. I don't know why. Maybe because watching him break felt like something private that I had no right to witness. Maybe because if I acknowledged it, it would become real. The next morning, he asked me to sit down. "Elena," he said, and his voice had this texture to it that I'd never heard before, scraped out. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you react." I nodded. "There's a man who wants to marry you." I actually laughed out loud in a cardiac ICU. "Dad, his name is Victor Hale." "He's Dad, what are you talking about?" "Elena," he grabbed my hand. His grip was weaker than I remembered, and that more than anything shut me up. "Please just listen, Victor Hale." I'd never heard the name, but I could feel the weight of it from the way my father said it, like it was something heavy he'd been carrying. 47 years old, wealthy, powerful, quiet. "He wants to marry me," I repeated slowly. "A 47-year-old man I've never met wants to marry me. He can protect you. From what, Dad? You're going to be fine." "Elena." His eyes went sharp for just a second, cutting through the exhaustion. "I am not going to be fine. And even if I were, there are things I've done, debts I have, people I owe that you do not understand." He swallowed. "If something happens to me and you're alone, those people will come for you. Victor Hale is the only person in the world they're afraid of." I stared at him. "You want me to marry a stranger?" I said, "because you owe money to dangerous people." "I want you to live," he whispered. "That's all I've wanted since the day you were born." I should have said no, I know that. I've had 6 years and approximately 400 therapy sessions to understand that an 18-year-old girl in an emotional crisis cannot give meaningful consent to a marriage arranged by a frightened parent in a hospital bed. But here's what those Reddit comments always miss when they say you should have just run. I looked at my father's face, and I saw that he was terrified, not for himself, for me. And I was 18 and I had already lost my mother, and I physically could not be the reason he died afraid. So I said yes. The wedding happened 11 days later. No engagement, no ring shopping, no venue tour. No dress fitting with my girlfriends, no bachelorette party, no rehearsal dinner. My father called someone, something happened behind closed doors I wasn't invited to, and then a date appeared on a piece of paper, and that was that. The ceremony took place in a judge's office on a Tuesday afternoon. Victor Hale was already there when I arrived. He was taller than I expected, dark hair with threads of gray at the temples. A jaw like it had been carved from something expensive. He wore a black suit with no tie, and he stood very still in a way that felt less like patience and more like control, like stillness was something he had chosen rather than something that had happened to him. He looked at me once when I walked in. A brief, assessing look, not cruel, not warm, clinical, like he was confirming I was real. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, nothing romantic, not even close. What I felt was a very specific kind of fear that I now recognize as the body's response to standing next to something powerful that you don't yet understand. My father held my hand during the vows. Victor and I did not hold hands. We signed papers. A judge said words. Someone took a photo I never saw, and then I was legally married to a 47-year-old man whose middle name I didn't know. Afterward, my father hugged me for a long time. "You're safe now," he said into my hair. I didn't feel safe. I felt like I'd handed my life to a stranger and watched the door close behind me. Victor's car, a sleek, dark thing driven by a man who never spoke, took us to a mansion outside Houston that I had not known existed until that moment. Gated, guarded. Set back from the road behind oak trees so old they looked like they'd grown there on purpose to hide the place from the world. Inside, everything was clean lines and muted colors, and the specific quiet of a house that has never had a child in it. Victor walked ahead of me without speaking. I followed because what else was I going to do? At the top of the staircase, he stopped and turned. "Your room is the third door on the left," he said. "The staff will bring whatever you need. If you want anything changed, tell Mrs. Reyes." I stood there. "My room," I repeated. "Yes, not our room." He looked at me steadily. Something shifted in his expression, not embarrassment exactly, more like bracing. Like he'd expected this question and had decided in advance how to answer it. "I didn't marry you for that," he said. I felt heat crawl up my neck. "Then what did you marry me for?" He was quiet for a moment. "The kind of quiet that isn't empty, it's full of something being carefully chosen. To keep you alive," he said. "That's all." He walked away. I stood in the hallway of a mansion I didn't want to be in, wearing my mother's necklace, married to a man who had just told me the most honest and somehow most devastating thing anyone had ever said to me. And I had absolutely no idea what to do with any of it. The first month was surreal in a way I still struggled to describe. Victor existed in the house the way weather exists, present, unavoidable, but somehow distant. He left before sunrise most mornings. He returned late. He ate dinner alone in his office if he ate at all. When we did occupy the same room, he was courteous in the formal, impenetrable way of someone who has decided that politeness is the ceiling of what they owe you. Not cold, not cruel, just contained. The staff was a different story. Mrs. Reyes, the housekeeper, was a tiny woman in her 60s who had apparently worked for Victor for 17 years and treated the whole situation with the same brisk practicality she applied to everything else. "He's a quiet man," she told me on my third day, handing me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for. "People think quiet means empty. It doesn't." "What does it mean for him?" I asked. She looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. "Full," she said simply and walked away. I spent a lot of that first month exploring the house, partly out of boredom and partly because I've always dealt with anxiety by moving. The mansion was enormous, more rooms than made sense for one person, all of them immaculate, most of them clearly unused. And then there were the guards, not visible exactly, but present. Men who appeared at the edges of rooms, who watched the driveway, who materialized when I walked near certain doors. At first it made me feel like a prisoner, then I started to understand it differently. I was being protected. Aggressively by someone who had committed significant resources to the project. The question was still, why? The answer came at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks into the marriage. I couldn't sleep. I'd gotten up to get water and was padding down the hallway in socks when I heard Victor's voice through the office door. He was on the phone. His voice was low, but the house was quiet enough that I could hear him clearly. "I told you what happens if anyone gets near her," he said, in a tone I had never heard him use in my presence. Flat, absolute, the tone of someone who is not threatening so much as stating a fact of physics. "If they find her, she dies. If she dies, you will spend the rest of your life wishing I had extended you the same courtesy. Are we clear?" I stood in the hallway with my heart trying to exit my body through my sternum. She, me. I went back upstairs and sat on my bed and shook for 20 minutes. Then I started packing a bag. I got as far as the closet before I stopped. Because the honest truth was, where was I going to go? My father was in the hospital. I had no money of my own, not accessible money. And whoever Victor was on the phone with, whoever it was that wanted to find me, was apparently still out there. I sat back down on the bed and stared at the wall and tried to decide whether I was safer inside this house or outside of it. I was still sitting there when the door opened. Victor stood in the doorframe. He was still dressed, he never seemed to sleep, and he was holding a manila folder. He looked at the half-packed bag on my bed, then he looked at me. "You heard," he said, not a question. I heard enough. He walked to the chair by the window and sat down, which surprised me. He set the folder on the edge of the bed. "I owe you the truth," he said. "I should have told you before the wedding. I chose not to because I thought it would be too much. I was wrong." "You were wrong about a lot of things," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, closer to respect. "Yes," he said simply. "Open the folder." The folder contained photographs, documents, printed records that I had to read twice before I understood what I was looking at. My father had borrowed money, not from a bank. From people who don't have banks. It had started small, a loan to keep the company afloat when the lawsuit drained the accounts, then more to cover legal fees, then more when the first loans came due and there was nothing to pay them with. A spiral that had been going for almost 3 years before my father's heart gave out under the weight of it. There were photographs of my father meeting with men I didn't recognize, in parking lots, in diners, in places that weren't the kind of places you went for legitimate business. And there was a note, printed on plain paper, just one line, pay US back or your daughter pays for it. I set the folder down. The room was very quiet. How did you get this? I finally asked. I have people who find things. How long have you known about my father's situation? Victor was quiet for a moment. Long enough. And you decided the solution was to marry me. Marriage to me means legal protection. It means you fall under the umbrella of everything that keeps me safe. The people your father borrowed from, they are dangerous, but they are not stupid. They understand consequences. He paused. They won't touch what's mine. I stared at him. That's why, I said slowly. That's the whole reason you married me, to turn me into property. I married you to turn you into untouchable, he said, and there was something raw in it that I wasn't prepared for. Those are not the same thing. We sat in silence for a long moment. Did my father come to you? I asked. Or did you go to him? Victor's jaw tightened slightly. He came to me. Why you? Why would he come to you specifically? A pause, long enough that I noticed it. We knew each other, Victor said, from a long time ago. I wanted to ask more, but something in the way he said it made me store the question instead of asking it. A feeling like this is the edge of something bigger. Step carefully. My father's going to be okay? I asked instead. His debts are cleared, his surgery will be covered, he will receive care for as long as he needs it. Victor looked at me directly. You have my word. Oddly, impossibly, I believed him. I put the folder back together and slid it across the bed toward him. Okay, I said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Okay, I'm not packing the bag. But I need you to stop treating me like I'm a package you've agreed to store. If I'm going to live here, I need to actually live here. You don't have to be my husband. But you have to stop being a ghost. He looked at me for a long moment. That's fair, he said, and he meant it. Things shifted after that night. Slowly, like tectonic plates moving, almost imperceptible until suddenly the landscape looks different. Victor still kept his distance. He still worked absurd hours, but he started appearing at dinner occasionally, started responding when I spoke instead of giving single-syllable answers. Once I came into the kitchen at midnight and found him making coffee, and he asked if I wanted some, and we stood at the counter and didn't speak, but it was a different kind of silence. Less like a wall, more like a window. I was exploring one Saturday afternoon, a habit I hadn't dropped when I found it. A door at the end of the east corridor that I'd always assumed was a storage room. It was unlocked. I pushed it open expecting boxes and instead found a hallway, leading to an entire wing of the house I hadn't known existed. I could hear them before I saw them. Children's voices, a television, laughter. I followed the sounds and turned a corner into a large, sunny room and stopped completely. 7 children. A range of ages, the youngest maybe 4, the oldest around 12. Some were watching TV on a large sectional sofa. 2 were doing puzzles at a table. One little girl, maybe 7, was sitting very carefully on Victor's enormous coffee table with nail polish spread around her. Victor was sitting in the chair beside her. He was wearing an apron. It had cartoon bears on it, and he was patiently letting her paint his nails, both hands, in alternating colors of pink and purple, while she narrated the process in intense detail, and he listened with complete, absolute attention. I stood in the doorway with my hand over my mouth. One of the older boys noticed me. Are you the wife? He asked. Every head in the room turned. Victor looked up. For just a moment, a single, unguarded second, something crossed his face that I had never seen there before. Something that might have been embarrassment or exposure or the expression of a man who has been caught being more human than he wanted anyone to know. I started. I'm sorry. I didn't know this was here. It's okay, said the little girl with the nail polish without looking up. He said you were nice. I looked at Victor. He said nothing. His expression had closed again, but something of that unguarded moment remained around his eyes. I gestured vaguely toward the door. Stay, said the little girl very firmly. I need someone to tell him he has to wear it to dinner. Later that evening, I found Victor in his study. Who are they? I asked. He didn't look up from his desk immediately, gave himself a moment, then he set down his pen. Foster children, he said. Some have been here for years, some are temporary between placements. You take them in? Yes, you pay for all of it. Yes, the one who was recovering from something, the small one with the leukemia. His voice didn't change, but something in his hands did. She's been in remission for 8 months. I sat down in the chair across from his desk. Victor, I said, who are you? He looked at me for a long time. Someone, he said slowly, who is trying very hard not to become his father. The story came out in pieces over the following weeks. Not all at once, Victor was not the all-at-once type, but in installments, late at night when the house was quiet and we'd somehow started ending up in the same room without either of us planning it. His father had been violent. Catastrophically, systematically violent in the way that some fathers are, the kind that build entire families on a foundation of fear and call it love. Victor had spent his childhood learning to be invisible, and his adulthood learning to be the opposite, powerful enough that no one would ever be able to touch him the way his father had touched everything around him. He'd made money, a lot of it, and instead of using it the way his father would have as a weapon, as a display, he'd started quietly building something different. The children, the foundation. The protection extended to people who needed it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked one night. We were sitting in the kitchen. It was almost 1 a.m. He'd made tea, which I still found secretly shocking every time. "Tell you what? Any of it, the kids, who you actually are. You let me think you were terrifying." He considered this. "I am terrifying. You're wearing a bare apron in my memory." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one. "The apron was a gift," he said. "From Mia." He stopped. "Couldn't what?" "I couldn't tell her it wasn't my style." I laughed, genuinely, completely laughed, and Victor watched me laugh with an expression I couldn't name and didn't try to. But I kept thinking about it afterward. I found the photograph in October, 3 months into the marriage. I was looking for a pen in the drawer of the side table in the library, the kind of small intrusion into someone's space that happens naturally when you share a house long enough, and underneath a stack of papers was an old photograph, slightly faded, the kind from the 90s where the colors are just slightly wrong. 2 young people standing outside what looked like a university building. The woman was laughing at something just off camera, her head tilted back, completely unguarded. I knew her face. I had grown up looking at that face. It was my mother. And standing beside her, young and almost unrecognizable without the weight of years on him, was Victor. They were standing the way people stand when they're in love. Not touching maybe, but angled toward each other with that gravitational pull that bodies do when they belong together. I sat down on the library floor. I don't know how long I sat there. When Victor came home that evening, I was waiting in the entryway. I held up the photograph. He went very still, not guilty still, stricken still. Like someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and has never quite prepared for the moment it actually does. "Tell me," I said. He sat down across from me and he told me. They had met in college. They had been together for 2 years, the happiest 2 years of his life, he said, without any drama, just as a fact. They had talked about everything, built everything. And then she had met my father, who was steady and warm and wanted the kind of life that Victor, at 23, was not sure he could offer. She chose my father. Victor let her go. "Did you hate him?" I asked. "My father?" "No," he said, and I believed him. "He made her happy, that mattered. You stayed in contact, loosely, over the years." He was quiet. "She called me once near the end. She was sick and she was frightened and he stopped, started again. She asked me to make a promise." "What promise?" "That if anything ever happened to her, if your father couldn't manage. If you needed," he exhaled slowly. "She said, just make sure Elena is okay." Those were her exact words. The room swam. "She never told me she knew you," I whispered. "I know, she never even mentioned." "I know. Why didn't you tell me this before the wedding, before any of it?" His voice was careful and quiet. "Because you were 18 years old and your father was dying and you were already terrified. How was I supposed to say to you, by the way, I loved your mother and she asked me to take care of you and that is the real reason we are here?" I didn't have an answer for that. "And afterward?" I asked. "Afterward you were here and you were brave and infuriating," and he stopped himself. Something shifted in his face. He looked down at his hands. "Afterward it became complicated." The word complicated sat between us in the room like a third person. I went to my room and cried for about an hour. Not from sadness exactly. From the particular emotional overwhelm of understanding that your life has a shape you never saw before, that things you thought were accidents were actually the slow unfolding of a promise made before you were old enough to make promises yourself. Then I dried my face and went back downstairs. He was still sitting where I'd left him. "I'm not angry," I said. He looked up. "I don't know what I am," I continued. "But I'm not angry. I think she trusted you. And I think you've been keeping that trust for a very long time." I sat down across from him. "Thank you for that." He looked at me for a long moment with that expression I still couldn't name. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. Like he hadn't planned to say it. "I know," I said. "Now drink your tea before it gets cold." What came next is the part I still have trouble talking about. My father, recovering slowly from surgery, asked to see me alone. He was stronger by then, enough to sit up, enough to hold a real conversation. But when I arrived, he had the expression he'd had in the hospital room that first night, the scraped-out expression. "I have to tell you something," he said. "About Daniel, my Uncle Daniel, my father's younger brother. I'd grown up calling him Uncle Danny, eating his barbecue, watching him at family holidays. He did it," my father said. "The company, the collapse, the lawsuit. It was him." The room tilted slightly. "He was skimming from the business for years," my father continued, his voice flat and awful. "When I started to notice, he moved faster. He went to the lawyers first. He framed the whole thing so that by the time I understood what was happening, I was already the one who looked guilty." A pause. "And when I started borrowing to fight the legal fees, he sold my name to the people I was borrowing from. Told them I was a bad risk, told them to apply pressure. He told them to threaten me," I said. He told them my father's voice broke just briefly. He told them you were leverage. That I'd pay anything to keep you safe. I sat very still. Does Victor know? Victor figured it out 6 months ago. He dealt with it. I did not ask what dealt with it meant. Some things are better left as implications. Dad, I said carefully. Victor took on all of this. He cleared your debts, he protected me, he spent months managing a situation he didn't create, all because Mom asked him to make one promise years ago. I looked at him. What exactly did he ask for in return? My father was quiet for a long moment. Nothing, he said finally. He asked for nothing. I fell in love with Victor Hale somewhere between the bare apron and the 1 a.m. teas, and the moment I walked past his study at midnight and heard very faintly piano music. He played beautifully, seriously, achingly beautifully. The kind of playing that sounds like memory. I sat outside the closed door for 40 minutes and listened. The next day I mentioned, casually at breakfast, that I thought I'd heard piano music during the night. He looked up from his coffee. The neighbors probably, he said. We don't have neighbors, I said. We have a gate and an oak forest. A pause. Old house, he said. Pipes. I looked at him. Victor, yes, you're a terrible liar. Something happened in his eyes, something warm and mortified and startlingly, unexpectedly young. Don't, he said quietly. I won't tell anyone, I said. I promise. He looked at me for a moment, then he looked back at his coffee, but the corner of his mouth did that thing it did sometimes, that almost smile. That was the morning I understood that I was in serious trouble. Not the love at first sight kind, nothing like that, but the slow, impossible kind, the kind that builds in the gaps between conversations and the warmth of someone's attention and the specific way a person looks when they don't know you're watching them be unguardedly themselves. I tried to talk myself out of it, regularly, with great effort and zero success. He was 29 years older than me. He was my father's protector and my mother's old love and somehow also my husband, and none of those things were simple. He kept his distance deliberately. He was careful with me in the particular way of someone who has made a decision and intends to honor it. But sometimes, late at night when we sat in companionable silence in the kitchen, I would look up and catch him watching me with an expression so full and so quickly shuttered that it made my chest ache. And I understood that I was not alone in the trouble. He collapsed on a Tuesday evening in November. We were having dinner, an actual dinner together at the table, something that had become a quiet habit over the preceding months. He was mid-sentence about something mundane, and then the glass was on the floor and he was following it, and I was around the table before I even registered moving, kneeling next to him on the tile, his name in my mouth like a prayer. The ambulance came. The hospital was quiet and institutional and terrible in the specific way that all hospitals are terrible when someone you love is inside them. The doctor found me in the waiting room 4 hours later. Advanced pancreatic cancer, terminal. The world did not dramatically end. That's the thing about genuinely awful news, the world just keeps going. The fluorescent lights kept buzzing. The PA system kept making announcements. Somewhere down the hall a baby was crying. I sat very still and let it settle into me. When they let me into his room, Victor was sitting up in bed looking like what he was. A person who had been keeping a very large secret and had just been relieved of it. How long? I asked. Elena, how long have you known? He held my gaze. Before the wedding. I sat down in the chair by his bed. You knew you were dying, I said, when you married me? Yes, and you kept your distance because I didn't want you to. He stopped, started again. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, stripped down. Unprotected, I knew the timeline, I knew how it would go. I thought if I kept things formal, he exhaled. I thought it would be easier for you afterward if you hadn't. If I hadn't fallen in love with you, I said, silence. Elena, I'm not asking a question, I said. I'm stating a fact. It's too late, Victor. It's been too late for months. I leaned forward. You should have told me. I know, his voice was rough. I'm sorry. I'm furious with you. I know, and I'm not leaving. He looked at me then fully without any of the careful management he usually applied to his expressions, and what was there was so raw and so frightened and so full that I couldn't hold his eyes for more than a second. I took his hand. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The year that followed was the strangest, most painful, most beautiful year of my life. Victor's prognosis gave us 8 to 14 months. We got 13. Chemotherapy, good days and terrible days and days so ordinary they felt almost normal until you remembered, and then the remembering hit like a wave. I learned how to advocate in hospitals. I learned his medication schedule. I learned that he slept with the lights on because of childhood nightmares he'd had for 40 years, and that this had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with survival. And somehow, inside all of it, our marriage became real. We traveled in the early months when he was strong enough. Nothing dramatic, we weren't that kind of couple. We drove through the Texas Hill Country and ate at diners and argued about music. We went to Santa Fe because I'd never been, and he wanted to see my face when I first saw the light there. We sat in the garden at night and looked at stars and talked about everything and nothing. We danced in the kitchen at 3 a.m. to songs he chose specifically because he knew they would make me roll my eyes, which he found unreasonably funny. He told me about his mother, who had been gentle and defeated. About the first company he'd built at 26 and the person who'd tried to take it from him and what he'd learned from that about power and about protection. About the foster children, how it had started with one a decade ago, a kid he'd found in a situation that reminded him too precisely of his own childhood, and how he'd found he couldn't stop. I told him things I'd never told anyone. About being 15 and watching my mother get sicker and pretending to my friends that everything was fine because I didn't know how to explain grief that hadn't finished happening yet. About the loneliness of the first weeks in his house and the specific moment, the bare apron, the nail polish, when I'd started to understand that I'd been wrong about him. He laughed at the bare apron story every time. Every single time. You have to admit, I said one night, maybe 4 months before the end, that walking into that room changed your whole scary billionaire image for me. Good, he said. I was tired of that image. You cultivated that image, for business purposes, not, he looked at me across the kitchen table. The lines of his face had sharpened over the months of treatment, but his eyes were the same. Not for this, for what then? For whatever this is, he said quietly. I reached across the table and took his hand. A marriage, I said, an actual one. He turned his hand over and held mine. Yes, he said. I suppose it is. 3 weeks before the end, he gave me a sealed envelope. We were sitting in the garden, late afternoon, the kind of golden hour light that makes everything look more significant than it is. He'd been quiet all day in a particular way, not sad exactly. Settled, like someone who has finally arranged everything the way they needed it to be. He held out the envelope. After, he said simply. I looked at it. Victor, promise me. I don't want to make promises about after. Elena, his voice was gentle, absolute, please. I took the envelope. I promise. He nodded, looked out at the garden for a moment. You are, he said quietly, the best thing that ever happened to me. I need you to know that. Whatever comes after, whatever you read, whatever you... He stopped, steadied. You are extraordinary. You have been extraordinary from the moment you walked into that judge's office, like you were walking into battle. I was walking into battle, I said. I know, that's why. I was crying. I wasn't embarrassed about it anymore. I love you, I said, because I had said it before, but it felt urgent. I need you to know that too. He looked at me. I know, he said. I have known for a long time. A pause. I'm sorry it took me so long to... Don't, I said. Don't apologize for the time we had. We sat in the garden until the light went and the stars came out. I memorized everything. The funeral was massive in a way that still surprised me, even though it shouldn't have. Hundreds of people. Politicians and businessmen and strangers who flew in from other states. A senator gave a eulogy about Victor's philanthropic work. A journalist wrote a piece that ran nationally. None of them knew the man I knew, the pancakes, the piano, the bare apron, the way he looked at the stars like he was having a private conversation with them. I kept Mia, the nail polish girl, close during the service. She held my hand and didn't cry because she was 7 and didn't fully understand, which meant she was handling it better than I was. 3 days after the funeral, I opened the envelope. Alone, in the library, middle of the day, the letter was 12 pages, handwritten in Victor's precise architectural script. I will not share all of it here. Some things belong only to me, but I will tell you what it contained. A confession. Years ago, Victor had discovered something through medical records my mother had left behind, records she had never shared with anyone while she was alive. I was not my father's biological daughter. I was Victor's. I put the letter down. I walked to the bathroom. I got very sick. Then I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time and let the information rearrange everything. My mother had been with Victor when she found out she was pregnant. She was already engaged to my father, had been for 2 weeks. She made a choice that I will spend my entire life trying to understand. She chose the stable life. The quiet life, the man who was already there. She never told Victor. Victor found out years after her death, through records she had left to her lawyer not to be opened until after my father passed, but Victor had resources that medical records did not expect. He sat with that knowledge for years, alone. And when my father came to him desperate, when my name appeared on a threat written by my uncle's dangerous associates, Victor understood for the first time that the promise my mother had asked him to keep was not metaphorical. He married me not knowing how to say, "You are my daughter," not knowing how to protect me without destroying my image of my mother, of my father, of the family I had grown up inside. Not knowing how to love me as a father when the law already called him something else, so he kept his distance. Not coldness, protection, not rejection, an unbearable, impossible love with nowhere to go. The final page of the letter said, I spent my entire life loving the wrong way, too controlled, too careful, too afraid of becoming the thing my father was. But you walked into my house at 18 years old, furious and frightened and more brave than you knew, and you made me want to be better. You made me be better. The marriage was never what it appeared to be. But the love as a father, as someone who watched you become extraordinary, the love was the most real thing I have ever known. I am so sorry I never found the right words while I still had time to say them. You deserved to know, you deserved everything. Part 13, after I did not touch his money, it felt wrong in ways I still can't fully articulate. The foundation he'd built received the bulk of the estate as he'd arranged. The foster children were provided for. Mrs. Reyes retired with enough to buy the house she'd always wanted in San Antonio. People online tell the story sometimes. They get most of it wrong. They call it disturbing, romantic, twisted, tragic. They debate it in the comments like it's a hypothetical rather than something that happened to an actual human being. I've stopped reading those threads. Here's what they miss. My father, my legal father, the man who raised me, the man who cried alone in a hospital bed because he was scared for me, is healthy now, fully recovered. Living in a smaller house in Austin with a garden he's very proud of. We have dinner every week. He knows the truth about Victor, about my mother, about all of it. We cried about it together for a long time. He is still my father. He will always be my father. The 7 kids Victor fostered are doing well. Mia is cancer-free and 9 years old now and recently informed me that she intends to be a marine biologist. I am at every birthday party. Every school play. There is a foundation that bears Victor's name and works to protect families caught in debt cycles and provide support for children in the foster system. I sit on the board. And me? I am 24 years old. I am in my 2nd year of a social work degree. I have an apartment with a piano in the corner that I am slowly learning to play very badly in the same late-night hours he used to. I am not fixed. I am not unbroken. Grief is not linear, and some days I still wake up reaching for something that isn't there, some warmth that used to be present in the world and now is gone. But I am okay. I am genuinely okay. I have been asked many times. Do you regret it, marrying him, agreeing in that hospital room, the whole impossible, painful, grace-filled thing? I've thought about it seriously, with the kind of seriousness it deserves. Here is my answer. At 18, I thought I was being handed to a monster to save my father's life. Instead, I met the man who had loved my mother before the world decided what she should do with her life, who had kept a promise for 16 years without being asked to, who built a wing full of children into his solitary, contained life because he could not stop himself from trying to save the things his own father had broken, who wore a bare apron and let a 7-year-old paint his nails and pretended unconvincingly not to play piano, who loved me in the complicated, wrongly shaped, structurally impossible way that he loved me more than he knew how to say. He was flawed, profoundly, infuriatingly flawed. He was too controlled and too secretive, and he should have told me the truth 100 times before he finally did. The situation should never have happened the way it happened. But here is what I know. Some people move through your life like weather, present for a season and then gone, leaving you mostly unchanged. And some people move through your life like tectonics. Victor Hale moved through my life like tectonics. I am not the same ground I was. And I have decided after a lot of time and a lot of 2 a.m. ceiling staring and a lot of therapy, that is not a tragedy. It is just the shape of a life.